Hello and welcome to the May 2025 ENSO seminar. So this morning or this afternoon or this evening, whenever it is that you happen to be joining us, we will be joined by Marta Pérez-Verdugo from the IAS Research Group at the University of the Basque Country. Marta is completing her PhD there in philosophy, but has a background in neuroscience, in philosophy of science, and has conducted work and research both in Spain and in Denmark at the University of Aarhus, and will be joining us today to share her work on sensorimotor engagement, autonomy and technological design, which is the topic of Marta's PhD research. So you're very welcome, Marta, and thanks a million for joining us and for sharing your work with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me here. It's such an honor to be presenting at the ENSO seminar. So I will be sharing my screen now.
Absolutely, please, yes.
Great.
And off we go. So I invite you to kick off.
Okay, so I hope it's working now.
Yeah, coming across very clearly.
Okay, great. So once again, thank you very much, Marek, for inviting me and for organizing this and for kind of maintaining this online space that is great for, I think, for sharing ideas within the community. So yeah, thank you very much. And yes, so I will be, as Marek said, I will be here presenting kind of the key takeaways from my PhD, I guess. I've titled the talk Sensorimotor Habits of Engagement, looking at the interplay between technological design and personal autonomy through the enactive lens. And so it's kind of the work that I've been doing as part of my PhD that I am doing in the IAS research group, and that is supervised by Xavier Barandiaran. So all of this has been thought with him, and he's been such a great supervisor. And the main question, I guess, of my PhD is how can we conceptualize and naturalize the relation between technology or technological design and personal autonomy. So, I think that in itself, that's an interesting question. And I think that particularly for enactivism, it's something that both things, both personal autonomy and technology, are starting to be looked at more carefully and kind of starting to be theorized, but still have a lot of room to develop. So I think that both areas are kind of an interesting and kind of a vibrant moment for enactivism to kind of get into them. But the particular relation between personal autonomy and technology is, or looking at it, is motivated mainly by the kind of current technological context, let's say. So the way that the contemporary digital world is organized is very much demands, I think, that we pose this question between about how the design of the interfaces that through which we access the digital world shapes behavior and in turn impacts our personal autonomies. So I think this has been posed by many different people, and in her big book on the age of surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff, for instance, actually talks about this, about how, or she relates this idea of interface design with the shaping of behavior, and how that is a crucial part of how the socioeconomic system that governs the digital world plays out. So the fact that digital technologies are designed to steer behavior in particular ways is a very big part of how they work. So I think that this kind of asks the question of, well, how exactly is this interplay between this design and personal autonomy? And this is something that maybe kind of the classical accounts of personal autonomy that focus mainly on beliefs and desires and this kind of these kinds of accounts maybe cannot really get that much into, because I think that the meeting ground between design technological design and personal autonomy happens at the sensorimotor domain. So it's basically a matter of how we interact with the technologies. So I think that it's important that we account for this from the sensorimotor domain and kind of find a way to talk about personal autonomy and about technology design in a coherent and integrated manner. So that's basically what I try to do, and I think that the sensorimotor domain, particularly as it is theorized within enactivism, provides fruitful kind of theoretical concepts to try to articulate a response to this or analysis of this. So I basically base my PhD and my work on the branch of enactivism, let's say, that is developed within the Sensorimotor Life book. Mainly, that's kind of my big reference, and Xavier's PhD as well. But yeah, the idea of the sensorimotor scheme, networks of sensorimotor scheme, is kind of my conceptual basis for my account. So what I will be doing today is I will basically go over both kind of areas, first personal autonomy and then technological design, from this kind of angle, and try to put them together with this kind of idea in the background of how this plays out in the context of digital technologies. So, okay, so we will go first towards personal autonomy. And when I was first reading about, well, personal autonomy, what exactly do we mean when we talk about personal autonomy, I kind of found out that I think that there are two senses or two scales of personal autonomy when we usually talk about it. And Marina Oshana, in her work, is, I think, very clear about it, because she makes this distinction between local autonomy and global autonomy that kind of represents those two scales. And so I think that local autonomy maybe is something that is kind of more related to the idea of agency, as it has been worked within enactivism, because it relates to the ability to be in control of specific actions. So it's local in that sense, that it's the fact that I am the one in control in a specific interaction with the environment. And I think this is captured by this idea of asymmetry within agency. I am kind of the source of the action in my interactions. So I think this is kind of what's at the basis of personal autonomy. This is the diagram of agency that they use in this paper that I defining agency, and I will be using this diagram also later. But this is one aspect of personal autonomy. But then, of course, when we talk about personal autonomy in kind of a full-blown sense, there is another aspect that is not so much related maybe to agency in that sense, but more to authenticity, we could say. So it's this idea of not only the fact that I am able to asymmetrically regulate specific acts, but that I have a personal way of acting, kind of, that is more temporally extended, and it's something that we ascribe to maybe a whole life, somebody sometimes, or at least to a longer period, and that is kind of that characteristic of personal way or of acting, of being. So I think that this part is also, like I said, starting to be theorized within enactivism. Still, maybe there's room to develop it further. I think that Michelle Mayes is one of the main contributors here in her book, Autonomy and Activism and Mental Disorders. She does provide an enactive account of personal autonomy, and with her ideas of affective framing and meta-regulation. I think she kind of gets to this kind of part of more related to authenticity. And in the Linguistic Values book, Ezequiel and collaborators, they also talk about personal autonomy as something that the kind of the centering that languaging allows gives us this ability for meta-regulation and a kind of regulation that has a ring more related to these ideas of authenticity. But in any case, the thing, what I am interested in is the interplay between both, and the fact that although both are important parts of personal autonomy, and they are somewhat independent in the sense that they don't need to necessarily coexist all the time. So you can have instances where you are kind of locally autonomous but not globally autonomous, or the other way around, where you can be globally autonomous but in specific cases not locally autonomous, as I've been talking about it. I do think that it is that you need to have been locally autonomous towards for a kind of extended time to be able to have this more full-blown sense of personal autonomy that also includes the global scale. So in that sense, local autonomy, or this kind of more agential notion of autonomy, is at the basis of personal autonomy. So in a paper that Xavier and I published in 2023, we kind of try to arrive at operative definitions of these ideas around personal autonomy in the kind of moving to the sensorimotor domain or to the enactive domain, and defining personal autonomy as the continuous ability to regulate our coupling with the environment and ourselves and others according to the norms that emerge from the sedimented effect of our previous regulated interactions. So this kind of aims to get at both branches. So it's kind of the ability to regulate, but not according to any norm, but to the norms that are sedimented after continuous regulations. So I think that this basically what this wants to get to is this idea that you need to have local autonomy to kind of set up the conditions for global autonomy and for like full-blown personal autonomy. So what I'm interested in is kind of the relationship between both, to understand why local autonomy plays an important role in the full sense of personal autonomy. So if we go to this kind of idea of agency and local autonomy and regulation of our behavior, well, we can think, well, how do agents regulate their behavior in the face of a changing environment? And this has been worked on the enactive kind of framework. And Ezequiel Di Paolo and collaborators in the Sensorimotor Life book, they draw from Piaget's theory of equilibration to talk about how do agents come to behave in, let's say, stable ways? How do they stabilize their sensorimotor schemes in interaction with the environment? And like I said, I am basing here my account on the idea of the sensorimotor scheme. I'm not giving a definition or anything. I kind of assume that it's more or less understood. It's basically the sensorimotor scheme are these self-sustaining patterns of sensorimotor coordination that crucially they involve the agent and the environment. So they are supported by the agent's body and the brain, but also by environmental support structures. So kind of this process of equilibration is, well, how do these sensorimotor schemes get stabilized in a dynamic and open-ended manner when facing an ever-changing environment? And equilibration is an interplay of two processes. So when a sensorimotor agent faces an environment, there is kind of a part of an assimilation process where she has a particular sensorimotor repertoire and she engages the environment within that sensorimotor repertoire without kind of a need for changing it too much, let's say. But on the other hand, another process has to happen many times because that's not enough, and it leads to breakdowns, and it faces challenges when novel environments are faced. And then a process of accommodation takes place where the sensorimotor schemes need to be reorganized, need to be transformed and changed to equilibrate this novel environment. So accommodation kind of refers to that process of rearranging or changing the sensorimotor schemes in order to accommodate novel environments. So I want to focus on this idea of accommodation. The way that I've been talking about it, and the way that I think they mainly talk about it in the Sensorimotor Life book, is kind of an agent-sided accommodation. So the way that we accommodate the environment, that we kind of rearrange the sensorimotor schemes, is very kind of agent-sided. So I maybe change my movements or that kind of stuff that is agent-rooted to stabilize novel sensorimotor schemes or to change the sensorimotor schemes already in place to gain an equilibration with the environment. However, there is, I think, like I said, the sensorimotor scheme, it involves not only the agent, but also the support structures in the environment. So another way that we can accommodate the environment is by changing the environment itself. So this is related to what Xavier and I have worked on and that we define as technical behavior. So it's this idea that sometimes to accommodate or to equilibrate our interactions with the environment, to stabilize specific sensorimotor schemes, we might change the support structures that constitute them in the environment and not only in ourselves. So we define technical behavior by saying that, well, we behave technically when we actively transform and organize elements of our body and in the environment with the intended effect of constraining or regulating couplings with or between other aspects of the environment. So it's this idea of regulating our equilibrations or our stabilization of our sensorimotor repertoire by transforming the environment itself. So we can think of maybe a too simplified example, but well, we have an agent who has her own sensorimotor repertoire, who maybe is faced with an environment in which she has to transport a very hot liquid. She has a container, and she might find difficulties in stabilizing a sensorimotor scheme of grabbing a liquid from a very hot container. If we're thinking of, let's say, a glass where the liquid is boiling hot, so she might not be able to successfully stabilize a grabbing sensorimotor scheme. So a way in which she may accommodate a successful sensorimotor scheme is by, let's say, constructing a handle in the vase. So kind of arriving to this idea of the teapot. Again, this is a very kind of simplified way of how a teapot comes to be, but it's kind of the idea in the back of it. So it's instead of just accommodating by changing structures in the agent or movements in the agent, I accommodate or I equilibrate my interactions with the environment by changing the environment itself. So by structuring the environment in such a way that it stabilizes a specific set of sensorimotor schemes. So that would be the kind of an insight of technical behavior. Now, the interesting thing here is that when another agent comes along, given let's say the material nature of the environment, those changes that I make to the environment survive my own interactions. So it's even after I've interacted with this teapot, the teapot will still exist as such, and it will retain that structure that I have created to regulate my sensorimotor schemes. So now when another agent comes along and she engages with the teapot, and she will undergo her own processes of accommodation, assimilation, and her own equilibration processes to interact with this novel object of her environment. The idea here is that I think that this structure of the teapot will, in a way, retain some regulatory power over how this novel agent stabilizes her own sensorimotor schemes. So she will assimilate, accommodate the teapot potentially in a way that reflects the kind of designed aims that were there from the original agent, who maybe is now long gone and is not even there anymore. So the object itself retains in its structure some sort of regulatory power. So it's this idea that technological objects sediment in their material structure the regulatory aims of their designers. Of course, the designers, it's not like everyone designs to stabilize their own sensorimotor schemes and then we all happen to encounter whatever the other agents did for themselves. We obviously have a much more complex context and agents designed directly for others, not just for themselves. But I think that the idea is kind of based on the fact that I can regulate my own sensorimotor schemes through the structuring of the environment, so I can also regulate others' sensorimotor schemes by the structuring of the environment. So in this sense, technical objects and technological design intervenes on the stabilization of sensorimotor schemes, and thus guide specific processes of equilibration in a way that, let's say, natural objects or objects which are rare for the human being to encounter. But if we encounter with a natural object that has not been designed, has not been structured in this way, I think that they don't intervene in the same way in the stabilization process. They also constrain our stabilization processes of sensorimotor schemes because they are a part of the sensorimotor scheme, but they don't intervene on it or guiding in this sense. So in these cases where we interact with technology, with technological technical objects, this asymmetry that we were talking about, that is in the basis of autonomy and of agency, is partially broken. So in this sense, the conditions for the enactment of personal autonomy are affected from this kind of level, just by the fact that we're interacting with something that is designed to precisely regulate how we stabilize sensorimotor schemes. So this can lead to cases where technology becomes very autonomy diminishing. It becomes something that can potentially diminish our personal autonomy. And that would be the case when these technical objects are imposing particularly rigid sensorimotor interactions that get stabilized very quickly. So as soon as I encounter the object, they are set up so that they are very effective in stabilizing very rigid sensorimotor schemes that then the agent has trouble regulating. So it's not set up so that the agent can then further regulate it. So in these cases, a certain degree of autonomy is lost through the displacement of the locus of regulation away from the agent. So the object itself kind of embodies some sort of that regulation and breaks this kind of asymmetry in a very strong sense. And I think that is the case with digital interfaces. So I think that this is something that is maybe too extreme. It's like a very extreme cases. This kind of environmental structures that can impose very rigid sensorimotor schemes is a very hard to find case, I think, in, let's say, the analogical world. Maybe in architecture is the other case where we can find something similar, where you can have like a completely designed environment that has sort of similar effect, but it's very difficult to be so good, let's say, at stabilizing schemes in others. But in digital interfaces, we have, I think, an unprecedented case of hyper design, what I call hyper design, which is basically wants to cover the fact that these technologies are completely designed in the sense that all of the space relevant for the task can be designed to the pixel. So everything can be designed with the same aim, let's say. And also, and maybe more importantly, that they can be dynamically transformed continuously and updated based on an unprecedented amount of data, precisely about how good they are in stabilizing specific schemes. So companies do A/B testing, for instance, of their websites, and they present two different versions of the same website to millions of people each, and they can really get some good data on which one of these designs is better at stabilizing specific habits in the users. So I think that this kind of amount of knowledge about the stabilization potential of design structures wasn't able until recently, with the kind of when digital technologies came along. So I think that that's why digital technologies are posing this question of kind of realizing that technology can really intervene in a very drastic way in our personal autonomies. And there are many different examples about this. One specifically that we analyze in that paper is the case of dark patterns. So these kind of tricky designs that want you to do things that you don't want to do, like clicking on download buttons that are not the ones that you want to click, or making it impossible to refuse cookies, for instance, which is, I think, a very common example that we all experience. I think that all of these are playing precisely with this, their potential to stabilize or hinder specific habits or specific sensorimotor interactions in their users. This does not mean that all technology is terrible and that we're all doomed because technology can make our personal autonomies go away. I think that technology can be autonomy enhancing as well. In many cases, it's just more like less extreme. But even if it were kind of thought of in relation to personal autonomy, I think that we can also think of how to use autonomy to enhance personal autonomy, which would in the end be designing technology with the aim of opening up further possibilities of regulation on the agent. So maybe we can have technical objects, and we do have technical objects that enable or signal or facilitate or augment the capacity of agents to regulate their behavior with that particular technical objects or with others. And these, I think, are technologies that open up new ways of then be able to enact the full-blown capacity of autonomy. So that's kind of a more positive note, that not all is just autonomy diminishing technologies. But I think that the main thing is that this kind of framework allows to think of both of them and to actually think of how the design of technology shapes the conditions of autonomy at this sensorimotor domain, and not only by kind of maybe interfering in the way that information is presented in a more in a way that affects our beliefs in one way or another, but kind of getting at the basis of all of that, which is in the end the sensorimotor interaction that we have with these technologies. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I do want to thank EAS Research, the research group, and the autonomy project that was funded by the Ministry of Science, Innovation and Universities of Spain, and that was kind of the project within I developed my work. And what I've talked about comes from some of the papers that I have been working on during my PhD, mainly from two. One is the paper that I mentioned with Xavier, that's personal autonomy and digital technology, that was published in Philosophy and Technology. And the other one, where I go a little bit more into the equilibration and part, is a paper that is now under review. So I don't know when it will be published, if it will be published, but it's about this idea of equilibration of technical objects. So yeah, that's it. That's all.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. So that's great. That's some obviously some, I think, very important work, and very nice to see, and some very cool ideas in there as well. So I will be keeping an eye on the chat on the live stream. So we'll sort of keep an eye out there, and if there are comments or questions that are raised by viewers live, I'll sort of feed those into the chat as we go along, or feed those into the discussion as we go along. So I really like that kind of identification of the sort of two different scales or domains of autonomy that you identify, and that, as you say, it's a theme that is present in kind of a bunch of the recent literature. So Michelle Mays's work in linguistic bodies, and of course it plays a central role in Sanneke Dehaan's enactive psychiatry when she talks about this existential aspect of enactment too. And so I guess there's that kind of distinction offers kind of a number of different ways in which we might kind of crack open some of the topics that you kind of talked about or raise later, particularly when it comes to technology. So one of the things, I guess, sort of a number of different questions around that. So at one point in the talk, it was around, somewhere sort of early on in the middle section there, you were talking about the asymmetry being partially broken, and the conditions for enactment of personal autonomy are affected by technological design.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it's kind of one of those scales or one of those domains of personal autonomy is affected more than the other, or is it always the case that both of them are in play and both of them are being affected simultaneously?
Yeah, so I think, or the way that I was framing it, I guess, on the talk is, I think that it maybe more directly affects the kind of local scale. And the way that it affects the global scale is that, well, the global scale depends on the local. So you need to have repeated instances of being able to regulate your behavior so that you can actually sediment a kind of a particular way of acting that then is what guides further regulation. So I think that in the case of these digital technologies, that's why I put a lot of emphasis on the fact that they can very quickly stabilize specific sensorimotor schemes that then are not regulable. So I think that it's basically the idea that, well, if the moment that I open TikTok, I am immediately, I stabilize the kind of scheme of scrolling down, that's impacting my local autonomy in that specific moment. So I'm kind of there, and then in each instance that I open it and then I'm scrolling, and the fact that I keep scrolling and I cannot stop scrolling, it's like kind of a local impact on autonomy. However, I'm not going to be able to then build like particular ways of relating to TikTok that I can be said to be my own if that's all I do. So I think that it's kind of the way that I'm framing it, the global scale, sorry, is dependent on the local. So it's by impacting one, you end up impacting the other. I don't think that's the only way to kind of think about it. I think that there's maybe uh, other ways in which technology is maybe directly impacting our abilities to kind of have a coherent uh, self or a coherent global personal autonomy. But yeah, that was kind of the way that I thought about it. Was more like through one you get to the other. And I think in the case of scrolling, it's very easy to see because you really have a sense in which you become someone who scrolls, and that's about all you can do. That's it.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. I mean, it's one of those occasions where a human being almost becomes a physical loop. The connection between your finger, the phone, and your other hand just is this sort
Yeah.
of, and you're genuinely stuck in an actual loop.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And something that we can, I think, very much all, well, the vast majority of us are awfully familiar with it.
Yeah.
And it's, I guess,
Absolutely.
so I, I mean, clearly, obviously, with the reference to Zhukov there and others, and the heavy emphasis on surveillance capital, platform capitalism, and the sort of plethora of control mechanisms that are examined in that literature. Do you consider these hyper designed technologies to always be antagonistic? So I know sort of later on you do sort of raise this question of autonomy enhancing technologies, but I guess is there, when we're talking hyper design technologies, does it necessarily always become antagonistic to personal autonomy, or do you think that it's possible to do hyper design that is also autonomy enhancing?
Hmm. Yeah, I think no, I think it's possible because in the end, hyper design basically means the fact that I think in the end it basically means that the designer, it's never one person, it's a team of person or whatever, but the designer as a kind of collective agent has complete control over the initial conditions, at least of the environment. So generally speaking, or generally in this context, the I think that's used so that they can remain in control of the space for as long as they want. But I do think that you can take advantage of that and set up the initial conditions, let's say, with this kind of control that you have, so that the let's say the space of possibilities is as open as it can be. So I think that would be a case in which you can have a hybrid design environment, because you are designing everything with that kind of like kind of one-sided control over the environment, but then kind of open up or kind of launch it for it to be appropriated by the users. But I think that the hyper design, I think, has to stop at some point. So you can hyper design it and set up the initial conditions so that then it can be transformed in a way. Yeah. But talking about hyper design, so cases in which the full kind of relevant environment is designed. In other cases, maybe a hyper designed aspect of the environment that relates to other non-designed or designed aspects by other agents maybe is a particularly good enabler of behavior that can remain hyper designed for long. But as long as we're talking about the complete space or the complete environment, I think at some point probably it will have to stop. But at the beginning, it can be maybe kind of a good setup of the conditions to for opening up a very kind of autonomy-enhancing world for the agent. Yeah.
From what you're saying there, it is sort of throwing into mind about the fact that if you were to hyper design or engage the tools of hyper design, so just thinking through both what how you've explicitly described it, and then I guess some of the implications of it, that in terms of, as you've put it, there is this very tight feedback loop between user and design that allows for the possibility of hybrid design that doesn't really exist in other places. And that tight feedback loop means that if we were to enable hyper design in the service of the values of the agents rather than the values of the designers and controllers, then you're immediately going to get forks, right? Everything's going to, the first thing you'll meet is user diversity. And of course, instantly you just have this sort of shattering of any likely, this is what I guess, it's almost like this is how hybrid design is often kind of pitched as being a very positive or potentially positive thing, because we talk about personalized design in many ways. The device or the machine or the software or whatever it is will become personal to you, but of course it's in the way it's often used, of course, is just to homogenize you, to make sure to sort of hem you in, whereas in fact if we were to do it in an autonomy enhancing way, the net result, of course, is you've immediately got a diverse ecosystem of wildly different things going on that'll be put to different uses. So that gets at something that sort of came up for me, and there's a little bit earlier on in your talk when you were just talking about the sort of, in essence, design is very much about the stabilization of certain kinds of behaviors, and so it's fundamentally a conservative thing in a lot of ways. It's about trying to find stabilization. It's about regulation and being regulatory. Although it's always the case, I guess, as well, that for anything to afford stable, effective action, it has to regulate, right? It has to provide a firm place to stand, right, for the lever to work. And so is there I guess, are there any particular sets of guidelines or any particular characteristics or features that you think distinguish, the tipping point between, providing opportunities or just providing constraints? Or is it always going to be a dynamic boundary that is going to be context specific?
Yeah, so I think it's generally always very context specific and also very activity specific. So I couldn't get into this in the talk, but the extent to which they are successful in stabilizing specific behaviors also depends in the activity that the agent was engaged in when encountering the object. So there's a lot about, well, it's not the same if I encounter an object from the same, let's say, train of sensorimotor habits that the agent or that it was designed to regulate, as if I just encounter it in a completely different kind of activity. So I think that in one sense depending a lot of the kind of activity that the agent encounters it from, which is also a product of previous design. So I think it's kind of it's all a web of how different designs are already affecting how you encounter the new ones. But beyond that, I do think that, at least thinking of digital technologies, I don't know exactly how to think about it for analogic or analog technologies, but in digital technologies, I do think, or we say in the paper that while many of there's kind of a tension between transparency and opacity in digital technologies. On the one hand, they are very opaque in the sense that you cannot really know how they work. Basically, it's completely in many cases at least we are completely blind as to the inner workings of these technologies. On the other hand, they are very transparent in the sense that they stabilize habits very quickly, so you don't have to think about the tool. So it's they are at the same time, or they are opaque because we don't have the resources to know about them, but also because we are encouraged not to think about them. Whereas maybe other kind of designs or digital technologies are less more what we say more translucent, in the sense that they are characterized by maybe being maybe a little bit more difficult to use, or maybe they require a more collective use or a kind of a more collective training on how we are using this specific technology. And in that sense, they do open up more possibilities of transformation and of regulation. So I think maybe that would be kind of using that translucent, transparent metaphor. It's something that we thought of when trying to imagine, well, what differentiates one from the other. And I think there the kind of collective aspect that I have not mentioned during the talk is very important, and it's kind of a good way to think of which technologies are more autonomy enhancing based on how they are thought for specific collectives and how they can appropriate them. Yeah. So that's one way, but it's true that kind of trying to take that idea of translucency to a chair is kind of, I guess they are more translucent in a because of the way that they are, because of their material nature. Physical objects tend to be more amenable to being not completely opaque and not completely transparent. So I guess maybe they are, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's I mean, there's two really key things that jump out of me just from what you're saying there. And here we're going to be very much into the realm of comment rather than question, but I'm hoping it'll be okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's two aspects in particular. One is the difference between the digital and the analog, or the digital and the physical, the virtual and the physical, perhaps. And the other is the collective and the individual. So I'm going to either forget to mention the collective and the individual in a minute, but we might come back to it. The one of the things you sort of raised it as a sort of a key point about the digital during your talk is that it is so constraining, that it really is exceptionally rigid in a way that things outside of the digital realm are not. And that rigidity, of course, is a crucial part of how it is that we become entrapped in the loops. But to my mind as well, it strikes me as also as that's part of what makes it so fragile too. You either you engage in precisely the habit that is supposed to be stabilized, or you're not engaging with this thing at all.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of an interesting characteristic, and something that is dramatically different from, say, like you gave the example of, so rather than analog, I think it's the physical. With architecture, where you still have these, to a certain extent, hyper design, or well, heavily designed, shall we say,
Yeah.
at least very rigidly designed. So I'm thinking of one of the lecture theatres in which I teach, where you have these, rows of, elongated benches, chairs, those sort of flip seat chairs, which are bolted into the floor. And there is only one way to effectively engage in that in that lecture theatre, which is for the students to sit in a front-facing thing. But if we were to decide to do something different, it would be awkward, but it would nevertheless, we could probably pull it off. So we could get people to sit on the benches instead of the seats, or you know, if I taught from the back of the class, the students would be very uncomfortable
Yeah.
and annoyed at me, but nevertheless, we'd be able to figure it out, because the physical world has that texture, that allows us to explore it and do something different. And so there's opportunities for resistance in the physical world that, of course, the digital world just doesn't allow. You do anything different and it just collapses. So, but so partly I wonder, if uh, the conceptual framework that you've set up, does that potentially offer us a way to think about how we would do resistance in this context? You know, given we sort of recognize a hyper-designed digital context, are there kind of principles of resistance or things we should watch out for to enable us to try and start working against those constraints?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And a quick aside, between the how to say it, like digital analog or physical virtual, I still don't. I never know how to say it, because I do not want to say the physical world as opposed to the virtual world, because you get to this idea of the digital world as it being a cloud that is nowhere, and then it's kind of very physical. But it's true that then saying analog, you think of, like, I don't know, an analog watch or something like it. I never know how to say it, but yeah. Anyway, that was just an aside. If someone knows how I should talk about
Absolutely
it, please
agreed.
let me know. But yeah, but going back to what you were saying, that I think it's very relevant, and that these kind of possibilities of resistance, that it's true in the physical world, we do have, and we don't seem to have so easily in the digital world. I think that we can. I mean, we probably can think of ways to implement that in the digital world. Um, but the thing that I think that the ways that they have been done so far is you have to rely on other digital tools. So there's, for instance, in my phone, I have it such that I don't have the home screen doesn't have like the usual icons. I just have like a black screen, and then it's written like a few. And then if I have to search for an app, I have to open up like the a tab and manually search it. So it's a way to try to disrupt the habits that otherwise get very quickly stabilized. But it's true that it's kind of you have to rely maybe on other tools, and I think that it in the end it does require, I think, generally probably more that we know a little bit better how to um, modify the digital environment, which is something that, generally speaking, almost no one knows how to do. I think there's a lot of kind of literacy, I guess, on digital um, environments that we currently mostly do not have. And I think that's also, it's not by coincidence. I think um, it's no coincidence that all schools are using Google Chromebooks from the beginning and not Linux, for instance. So I think it's probably kind of along those ways of we are much more literate on how to engage differently in the physical world than we are in the digital world. So maybe it goes around that idea, and maybe kind of something that gives you the tools to build your own resistance tools. Um, Again, probably in a collective way, and you're not going to make anything by yourself, but I guess it would go along those lines, because it's true that it's easier to think of so in the physical world. There are ways in which people try to. I mean, there are many people who kind of are very masterfully playing with the algorithms, even if they don't know how they work, to kind of get around some of the constraints that they impose. So maybe it's true that they are very recent technologies. We've also kind of accepted that they are the way that they are when they are. I mean, they are 20 years old or less, many of them, and so maybe we just have to build the resistance over time and learn to cope with these technologies, and we still haven't done that. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, there's been a capturing of the imagination by these, and a constraining of the
Yeah.
imagination by the narratives, particularly out of what's called Silicon Valley, which is really just a bunch of companies rather than this magical place full of, you know, heroes and so on. But that brings us really nicely to the issue of the collective, which I think is really crucial, and the way it recurs in the themes, particularly in the later sections of the talk, I think was very important. Because one of the things that struck me, and it was in one of your answers too, you talked about how the activity matters. So not just the particular sensorimotor scheme, but the activity that it's embedded in. And you were giving the example of TikTok, and I'm thinking, yeah, actually, if I'm engaging with TikTok, I'm doing one thing as a user. But if I'm doing TikTok research, I don't get drawn into the loop in the same way. I'm giving it to someone else. So I'm in the presence of TikTok, but it's not dragging me in because of the different orientation that I have to the app. And it put me in mind about the fact that in almost every domain in which we live and work, we are inducted into the appropriate behavior in that domain by other people. As we're grown up, we learn we learn most of it from parents and other caregivers about how to behave in public and even how to behave at home in private and so on. But these kind of digital places are entirely different. We only learn about them through the digital places, which of course is controlled and manipulated in particular ways too. And so there isn't a means to collectivize as straightforwardly. It does happen, of course, with algo speak and the like, but there's a breaking of that contact with others, which seems to play a fundamental role. And so I do that. It would seem that capacity to collectivize would seem to be a fundamental part of perhaps autonomy enhancing technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I think spot on, and I'm not sure I had actually thought about it or put it that clearly in my mind, so that helped me a lot. Because I absolutely the example that I put of the teapot, clearly no one just encounters a teapot and magically thinks, okay, I'm going to add it a handle, and I also don't know how exactly you would encounter a teapot and put it a handle, but obviously technical behavior is heavily mediated by collectivity and by sociality, and that's a hugely important part that I have kind of omitted in my analysis because I wanted to focus on specifically the relation with the object, which is maybe too much of an abstraction, but yeah, I think that's definitely the way that we learn to engage with technology is mediated by how other teachers teach us to do so, or how we see others relate with technology. And it's true that that's a particularly striking difference with the digital world, that we are, in many cases, it's like a very social world, but a very isolating world in that sense. And they tend to be more and more isolating. I remember that I had this feeling when I was a heavy Twitter user when I was younger, and there you even had a little bit more sense of kind of community. You know more or less how other people were using it, because you could see how people related to other posts. You could see who liked what post and who retweeted what, and how it kind of circulated. Whereas when I started to use TikTok, I realized that it was like you really don't know if what you're seeing is what everybody else is seeing, or if they are having completely different experiences, because it's much more different or difficult to know who interacted with what and in what ways. You're just like presented with content, and you know that there's people out there and you're watching people making content, but it's true that the dynamics within the platform are much more opaque in that sense. So yeah, so it's true. I think that's a very good point, that is a very big difference, and that's maybe why we can think more easily of possibilities for resistance in the physical world than in the digital world. So yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah.
I mean,
Thank you.
Just what you're saying there. Sorry, it's triggering like those differences between settings, as you're saying, like Twitter works one way, TikTok another, and of course I'm stuck in mind of Mastodon then as one of these ostensibly autonomy enhancing social networks, and intended to be a much more social network. So this federated social media. But in that situation, because there is no singular vision of a top-down notion of community, in order to learn how to use it, you have to essentially it's managed by the community. You have to be a citizen, which means you have to behave appropriately within the community, but it also means you have to induct others. And of course, if we're coming from somewhere like where there's a much more centralized view of things, the experience of being inducted by others sounds like people are wagging their fingers at you all the time, because that's essentially what is happening. It's there being your parents going, well, no, that's not quite what we do here, or let's be polite. And so it all feels like you're being chided and scolded continuously, which of course is what nobody's looking for that in terms of social media. So I guess being aware, like for all the fact that the term is social media, the reality is that we don't think about the social aspects of it to any great extent, and so much of it is purely just done on the basis of, well, it's a web application.
Absolutely. And it's true that the very kind of I don't know, it's not very hopeful to see how people, once Twitter kind of became something else and many people wanted to go away, how it was very difficult for people to stay in places like Mastodon, where exactly like the social is actually much more important. It's much more, it depends much more on being, like you say, a citizen of the app instead of a user of the app. And I think that's once again we've kind of been very I don't know, like very, very habituated to this is the way in which we are using social media, as if it was the only way. And because it's very comfortable, it's very, you just get there and you are already doing something and you know what to do. And you don't have the friction that comes with actual sociality and having to navigate how to create the space for a collective. So yeah, that's again very good point. Yeah.
Very good. So, I mean, it's lovely. It's like your notions of autonomy restricting versus autonomy enhancing technologies really is a quite a powerful framework with which to sort of crack open all of these issues and sort of examine them. And as I say, like there could probably be no more important work than identifying means of resistance in the ecosystem that we currently find ourselves.
I think that's a kind of I think it's kind of a good thing to kind of try to think of, and it's been thought of, and there's this tradition of participatory design, for instance, and kind of these ideas that have been coming from other traditions, but kind of try to make this happen and make this exist. And in our work, we analyze the case of Decidim, which is a platform made for, well, it's a participatory platform, and it's I think there exist these kinds of platforms that are made for the collective to appropriate the platform. So it's not something that that is just we can dream of, but there are actually research and actual things in place happening to make this a reality. And I think it's a kind of a way to go, and it could really illuminate new ways to relate with digital technologies or with technology in general. Yeah.
Well, superb. On that very positive note, I appreciate we're sort of very coming close to the end of time. So I want to say, Marta, thank you very much for sharing your work. Really
Thank
interesting.
you.
And as I said, properly important work being done here, and it's really good to see. So I hope that forthcoming paper gets into the in-press very promptly.
Let's hope.
Yeah, and the very best of luck with the future of your research.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me and for hosting this. And yeah, it was great. Thank you for the conversation as well. Very, very great ideas that I will surely incorporate. So thank you.
Thanks very much. And so hopefully we will see others again. So this will be our last ENSO seminar for the current academic year. But hopefully we will see people again in the autumn for the 2025-26 series of the ENSO seminars. Have a good summer, everybody.